there's going to be a lot of details. What I've prepared for you is a cascade. It matches the rain that's beginning outside. There's too much here. It's meant to wash over us and be worth coming back to later. When we're done, we'll settle into worship and see what is meant to rise. So, here we go. First up, the metaphor, fractals. I'm profoundly inspired by the idea of fractal action and the work of activist and organizer Adrienne Marie Brown. That's her there on the left. In her book, Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change and Changing Worlds, she says that fractal thinking means recognizing that the health of the cell is the health of the species and the health of the planet. Okay, I like this, but what exactly is a fractal? I found out there's a place called the Fractal Foundation, who has a convenient website, fractalfoundation.org. And they say that a fractal is a never-ending pattern. Fractals are infinitely complex and self-similar across different scales. They're created by repeating a simple process over and over in an ongoing feedback loop. Driven by recursion, fractals are images of dynamic systems. Okay, there's a lot there. We're going to take a look at some of those pieces. So, first off, what on earth does it mean that fractals are infinitely complex patterns that are part of self-similar systems across scales? What it means is, even though the depth and breadth of a fractal is unending, there's nevertheless some kind of similarity across it. Even out on the farthest edge, there's something similar and connected to another piece of the fractal, even though it's a profoundly far way away. This one is called the Sierpinski triangle fractal. And it looks like a big triangle because it is, but it's also made up of smaller triangles that look just like the larger triangle. So when we zoom in, it's like we didn't zoom in. And then when we zoom in again, there's more and more. In fact, if you keep zooming, it goes all the way down. It never ends. It never ends, friends. Fractals are dynamic systems because changes at any small level result in changes across the whole of the system. The way I see it, taken in the context of a faith community, this means that large visions and convictions that we have ought to show up both in personal practices and in large practices. My hope is that if we're attentive to the way the small and the large are related, we will realize more deeply how we're connected to one another. You'll see this little candle that's being drawn right now. Well, in a little bit, it's going to become a fractal connected to a whole world larger than it. We're going to pull it into the screen and say, hey, please do something like the thing right before you. We'll pull in another one and we say, you, be like that, slightly changed, and we'll move it. And now the whole system spirals all the way down. All of the small pieces make up the large pieces. The large pieces are in the small pieces, all the way down. And all we need to do is go back to our little candle friend, change it a little bit, replace its top, and as soon as it's done, that large drawing has already become new. The large and the small are related. And we will realize more deeply that we are connected to one another, to creation, and to divine. Through the lens of fractal thinking, I feel like it's easier to see how we are members of one another. We are a gathered people made more whole by realizing that our stories and hopes are braided into one another to those who have come before, and the invitation to follow God's call ever more deeply. In his Book of Hours, the poet Rilke wrote in a way that sometimes feel like he's writing to a lover and to God at the same time. He says, "You too will find your strength. We will sense you like a fragrance from a nearby garden and watch you more through our days like a shaft of sunlight in a sick room. We are cradled close in your hands and lavishly flung forth. Lavishly flung forth there, out on the farthest edge, even there we can find something similar and connected." Thinking fractally, if we want to know what expressions of ministry can exist in a faithful meeting ecosystem, then we can begin to look at what expressions of ministry can exist within individuals in our meeting, what expressions can exist within New England Yearly Meeting more broadly, and ways in which faithfulness is expressed in the world beyond the yearly meeting, as friends give their testimony to their faith in all walks of life. Those three pieces are all yoked and connected through the center. So there's the metaphor that's going to be in place through the whole rest of this, fractals. Next up, we're going to do study number 1. This is a good time for a breath. First piece I want to share with you comes from the work of family systems theory and the scholarship of a guy who's a psychiatrist named Murray Bowen. That's Murray. I'm not a therapist. However, the work of psychology and psychological studies is a part of my day-to-day life as a researcher and as a professor whose job it is now to train ministers. I want to share with you one particular piece of systems theory because I think it's very much related to what it means to be thinking about supporting ministry. So, what is family systems theory? It was developed in the 1950s by Bowen to better understand individuals and their complex relationships and dynamics with families. Based on years of research, Bowen noticed that individuals, each of those little dots can be thought of as a person, can be better understood in the context of their families. And families can be better understood not just as a collection of individuals, but as organizational units, right? We pull on one another. We connect with one another. Relatedly, systems theory suggests that individuals within a family are interdependent on one another. How we think and feel and act is significantly influenced by the family we were raised in, as well as some of the other intimate circles in which we're a part. Thinking this way has helped me to realize that each individual in a system is connected to larger systems. And these systems include the joys of family and friends, but also the realities of hardship, sorrow, and trauma that sometimes accompany family and organizational life. In an ecto of fractal thinking, it's also important to recognize that systems are embedded within larger systems. Structures of systemic oppression are part of complex patterns that do not exert their influence equally across all people. Unfortunately, a lot of our world is not set up to recognize systems or the impact they can have. We tend to focus on just what's in front of us and sometimes really just think about the short-term benefits and harms. Perhaps this is most obvious in situations where we're thinking about global climate change and the benefits of the current moment in comparison to the realities of generations to come. But there's other levels about this as well. I think a lot about something I heard from my mentor, Steve Sandage, who's a research psychologist here and a mental health professional in Massachusetts. He once shared a story with confidentiality maintained about work he did years ago in another state with a client. So the person he was working with was really struggling, and much of it had to do with a romantic relationship that this person was in. And Steve really wanted to figure out how to bring in the partner of this person so that they could have some conversation. He suggested one of his colleagues who could begin to see them both. Unfortunately, at that time, the partner wasn't insured at the same level as Steve's client. And owing to insurance issues, they couldn't get services on their own. So what did this mean for Steve? It meant that though the person he was trying to help and serve would probably have been helped and served the most by bringing someone else into the conversation, the mental health care structures couldn't manage it. The problem either had to reside directly with the person in front of Steve, or it couldn't be helped. In this instance, insurance was set up as if the connection between Steve and his client was all that was needed. Though insurance structures don't always realize we're connected to others, rest assured we are. And those connections themselves interact. One of the things that Bowen realized over years of research is that a family system, an organization, will repeatedly settle into a situation that's stable. Bowen calls this the equilibrium point of a family system. This is the kind of routine, habituated pattern that a family falls into that's predictable and familiar to everyone in it. One of the insightful pieces of Bowen's work is to recognize that just because a system or family has found an equilibrium does not mean that it has found a healthy and flourishing equilibrium. Stability is not the same as health. Sometimes the patterns of repetition within an organization are unhealthy, but they get repeated because at least they're familiar. I am not suggesting that this is always conscious or intentional, but sometimes the fact is we would rather deal with the devil we know than the uncertainty of what might yet come. I sometimes think of systems as a kind of very complex mobile, where movement in any part can move all the parts. Equilibrium is the resting place that the mobile often finds itself settling into. Individuals are tied to individuals who are tied to groups who are tied to groups of groups. And as one begins to move, they all can be moving. Pushing out as part of a system has implications out on the farthest edge. What this means is that change in a system is always going to require some liminal in-between moments of confusion and shuffling and transition between one equilibrium state and the next. When you try to shift a system to greater health, there's going to be resistance because it will be new. Under stress, Bowen found that families often revert to familiar patterns of functioning that are not always healthy. Sometimes it will be necessary for a family or an organization to purposely enter a period of disequilibrium or destabilization because they're trying to figure out how to reach a new way of being that's more healthy. David Snarsh was a therapist who worked intensely with Bowen family systems theory, and he has some language that I absolutely adore. He said that when he's working with a family or a couple, he sometimes needs to turn up the heat and actively encourage a controlled disequilibrium in their family so that they can move to a healthier new way of being. He talked about the work of turning up the heat as a relationship crucible in which new connections could be forged. As an intentional action with all parties consenting to be part of something new, even if it can be hard, there can be an incredible benefit to this kind of collaborative confrontation, turning up the heat. Because change is so hard, in moments of transformation, we can feel like our whole way of being hangs in the balance. But then just when we think we have seen the end, we see a new way. In Isaiah 43:19, we get to read God say, "See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland." We are called to encourage one another and to build each other up. But to do that means we have to have some kind of deep connection with one another. And this requires a level of intimacy we do not often talk about in our meetings. Part of the reason I believe we need to think about love more broadly is because our narrowness comes from the fact that in Scripture, love is this incredible thing. In the Hebrew Scriptures, the word for heart is the place where feeling and thinking both happen. We have this idea that thinking happens in our brain, but the Israelites who had those scriptures thought the heart was where thinking and feeling both happen. That word, leb, is the home of both cognitive and emotional responses. Whenever I see heart in Scripture, I internally think of it as heart and mind. One of the things that this suggests to me is whenever we read about the heart or love in the Bible, especially if the speaker was Jewish, like Jesus, something more than an emotion is going on. Loving someone isn't just a feeling. It's a way of knowing. It's a connection. Between the multiple Greek words for love and the fact that the Israelite worldview had loving and thinking rooted in the same place, there is a lot going on scripturally in terms of how we're supposed to care for one another. Change with families can be some of the hardest change because if our family is one in which we find a home, our hearts are in the balance. If our meeting is a place we want to call home, our heart is in the balance. Intimacy is so regularly modeled on marriage that we lose track of the many ways that love can be expressed. Sure, for those of us with primary romantic partners, being vulnerable and sensitive is something we usually hope for in a companion. But that is not the only way that care shows up. There's different kinds of love and different ways that we can be intimate with one another. Before his crucifixion, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. In John 21, we find Jesus after the resurrection, and there, over a meal of fish cooked on coals, Jesus asks Peter if he loves him. Peter replies that he does, and Jesus responds, "If you love me, you will love my sheep." If you love me, says Christ, then you will love those you are yoked to. That is how you will show it. 3 times does Jesus remind Peter that Christians have been made members one of them. Thinking fractally, if we want to ask questions about how our meetings can grow in their ability to recognize, cultivate, and steward gifts of ministry, we should be able to ask about intimacy across the system. How is it with your soul? Do you take time for prayer and refreshment? When you need support and nourishment, who do you turn to? How is truth prospering here? Are you wrestling well there? Does your meeting feel enough to people that they can risk being vulnerable enough to grow? Do you avoid talking about harm? Does your avoidance keep you from harder and deeper connections? Are you in need of a crucible moment to forge new connections? Where might you find that heat? When the community is having a hard time, who do you reach out to for support? Anyone? Is our yearly meeting in right relation with other yearly meetings, with other churches? Are we living in gospel order on this land? Can we even sustain this pattern of life? The small and the large. Study 2. Canopy soil. In the early 1980s, Nalini Nadkarni was a doctoral student at the University of Washington in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. She's studying forest ecology, and she had gotten it into her head that she wanted to study trees and soil, not from the safety of the ground, but way up in the tops of the trees. Apparently, at that point in time, no one had really studied the canopy at length, and so it took some persuading before she had approval to begin her work. It wasn't long before one day, Nalini is way up in the branches of a maple when she notices that at the branch union, that's the place where the trunk and the branch meet, there's some really thick moss growing, interspersed with lichen ferns. Part of the sampling she's doing, she had to cut into it and collect a nice big fat slice of it, all the way from the top down to where the moss was growing on the branch. So she's up there cutting, she doesn't hit a branch. After the moss rhizoids and fern roots, there isn't a branch, but 100 feet up in the air, soil. Somehow, dozens of feet up there in the air, there's rich, healthy soil. And not just a little bit. Way up in these trees, there is a full 12 inches or more of soil. Decades of cycles of growth and decay mixed with decomposing remnants of ferns and leaves that have fallen from higher up to result in canopy soil. So Nalini finds soil 100 feet higher up than when she expected it. That's the first bit. We'll come back in just a moment to Nalini, but now there's another important piece that requires us to do a little time travel. So that was the 80s. Now we're going to zoom to 2013. Now, Karina Mifune starts research, same university, same place, Pacific Northwest. She's interested in learning more about that soil that was discovered. She's curious about this canopy soil, not only because it's particularly rich in nutrients, but because the soil at the base of the trees, the place where the tree's roots are, is actually nutrient depleted, especially in the spring when tree growth is at its peak. So she's thinking about the grand irony of the fact that what the trees need most down here is actually very close, but inaccessible because it's up in the canopy. Apparently, when nutrients in the soil are relatively accessible, the trees work in collaboration with fungus and each other to exchange nutrients in a mutually beneficial way. But when resources are scarce, trees are not as likely to play nice. Karina Mifune puts it this way. She says, every spring there's a big battle to uptake nutrients. So there's this slow spring tree fight happening every year, and the answer is sitting in the canopy right there, which is good to know because it helps explains the other thing we discovered in the rainforest. See, back in the 80s, when she was one of the trailblazing scientists of canopy biology, Nalini didn't just document soil. When she's up there, she makes another discovery. As she clears away the moss and soil, she still doesn't hit the branch. Underneath the soil were roots. And they weren't coming down from the ferns, but from somewhere else. At first, she can't figure out where they go, so she begins to trace them. Eventually, she follows the oldest and thickest canopy roots down the side of the trunk, all the way to the soil level. The tree had sent roots up its own trunk into this reservoir of life. Why would a tree spend energy when it's generally understood that roots go down and out? Why would a root grow up? Well, Karena's soil research suggests an answer. During droughts and particularly competitive spring growing seasons, these trees have the ability to tap into their own reserves, sending roots into the rich soil that has resulted from years of growth and change. If we have someone in our community that we feel has gifts of ministry, but we don't feel like we have a good sense of them or their gifts, what are we to do? Well, let's say we try to reach out to this person, but they seem reluctant to get as deeply connected as we might want. Then what? Well, one option is to say, I guess they don't want to be rooted in our community. That's okay. We're certainly not going to force them to. And then what happens? Well, sometimes they figure out how to be of service regardless, but never feel like their work is grounded in the meeting. They send their roots elsewhere looking for life, but stay in our midst as a ghost. Other times, the person and the gifts they steward just drift away. And sometimes, if we take the care and the time to see why that person hasn't connected, we'll hear an answer. We will listen to their stories and sorrows and their soaring hopes and to their needs as they articulate them. And sometimes it is good, even though it is hard, when caring for them means we need to care in a new way that requires a new pattern. I worry, friends, when we remain too fixated on the fact that some folks have figured out how to thrive in the midst of conditions that are not conducive to flourishing. Yes, it is amazing that we've got these trees that have learned to grow their roots the wrong way up to find what they need. That's incredible. Trees are incredible. You're incredible. And also, let's do Karena's work as well. Let's look and see if there are things we can learn about the soil from which the trees grow. Are there things down here on the ground that are leaching it of life, so that there are some in our midst who find that they need to search out their nourishment alone? Thinking fractally, if we know that sometimes a system needs to be destabilized to reach new, healthier equilibrium, then we should be able to ask this across the system. Knowing that the light will search me and lay open what needs change, what parts of my life do I avoid bringing into question? What ministries wither on the vine because no one said, I see you, to someone with an emerging leading or a gift that could be steward? Do we allow ourselves to become tender to one another so that we can listen to the still small voice that's challenging to hear when we're hard-necked? What leaders do we lose because they want to find a place of connection and intimacy but encounter only silence? How many of our meetings and quarters would love to be reached out to by other meetings and quarters? What obstacles are in the way of that connection? The large and the small. So we're at the end. In a little bit, a song is going to start, and following it, we will transition into worship. And I hope that this music will be a balm and an opportunity for settling. But before we get there, I want to share a few thoughts that have emerged for me as important to name. For those of you who are looking for specific tools, know that I've put together a list of things, including a lot of the content that informed my thinking today, and I made them all available online. If you want the link, you can either pick up a little piece of paper I've got here, I'll have them up in the front, or it'll be emailed to you tomorrow if you were registered. I hope that those things will prove useful to you, but at a deeper level, here's how I'm hoping that we can come away from our time together today. Thinking fractally, if we want to know what expressions of ministry can exist in a faithful meeting ecosystem, then I think we need to ask what conditions are depleting the soil we're rooted in. One of the benefits that humans have over trees is the speed at which we can change. If we learn of practices that are depleting our soil, then let us address them. I want to encourage us to think about ministry less as an object and more as a process and a set of relationships. I want us to be courageous enough to be intimate with one another so that we can name unhealthy patterns, allowing equilibrium to be changed en route to greater life and life always more abundant. I want members and attenders at our meetings to feel safe, intimately seen and accompanied. I want this accompaniment to catalyze others to feel more inspired to explore their faith. And I want folks associated with our meeting and the people in which the meeting community is situated to all see more deeply the ways in which they're connected to each other, to creation, and to the divine. I don't know exactly how to support better ministry, but I trust that it is possible. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, but not yet seen. I want us to remember friend John Bellers, who told us that watchfulness out of meetings is the best preparation for worship within. Let us watch over each other. Let us love one another. Let us look to the hope of what is to come. Let us work together within and between. The reign of God is among you. It is within you and between you. It is in your love for each other and your neighbor. The reign of God is here as we gather as a body. The reign of God is between our gathered bodies. It is that of God in you and what God calls us all into next.